So today we heard from GM. This is exactly what we are seeing, what we're projecting, and specifically they announced a $1.1 billion hit to profit in the second quarter.
Everything built with steel, you've seen the cost go up 30% in the U.S.
Steel, aluminum, automotive components, they don't dominate headlines daily, but right now they're at the heart of one of North America's most significant trade disputes. Since returning to office, President Trump has reinstated tariffs as the centerpiece of U.S. trade strategy. His stance has been forceful, erratic, and increasingly personal, even with long-standing partners like Canada. By mid-2025, Canada is confronting duties of up to 50% on steel and aluminum, and 25% on all vehicle parts brought in from abroad, under the latest phase of Trump's reciprocal tariff campaign. The intention was to safeguard American employment. Instead, it ignited a ripple effect beginning with Canada's metals sector.
Down that road, I wouldn't recommend the president going down that road, because every tariff on Canada is a tax on Americans.
Rather than appeal for relief, Canada acted decisively. Spearheaded by Ontario, provinces began revamping local manufacturing. Premier Doug Ford declared initiatives to retool industries producing everything from beverage cans to construction-grade steel. The federal administration, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, matched the momentum, unveiling focused financial aid, slashing bureaucracy, and expediting project approvals. The outcome: a coordinated national effort to lessen dependence on U.S. metals and reinforce Canada's industrial backbone. But the move was more than reactive, it was tactical. Canada's expanded steel output is now being redirected toward internal automotive assembly and markets in Asia and Europe, bypassing the U.S. altogether. This isn't merely a trade response, it's a structural economic shift, already influencing the broader North American car industry. Trump's trade measures weren't intended to undermine American manufacturers, yet the fallout is swift. In Q2 2025, General Motors disclosed a $1.1 billion deficit linked directly to escalated material expenses. Stellantis followed with a $2.7 billion financial setback in the year's first half. Both firms cited increased costs of metals and modules that now cross U.S., Canadian, and Mexican borders several times, each transfer incurring additional tariffs. These automakers spent years establishing supply routes under the USMCA agreement, a framework Trump himself helped modernize. Now his tariffs are unraveling that very structure. According to the American Iron and Steel Institute, domestic steel rates have climbed as much as 30% since March. For car makers, that equates to $2,000 to $4,700 more per vehicle. Some firms offered short-term employee discounts to soften the impact, but such measures fall short against multi-billion-dollar quarterly losses. And there's a broader implication: inflation. Analysts at the Congressional Budget Office cautioned that rising production costs in the automotive space could drive up overall inflation in the latter half of 2025. As Canadian provinces rally behind Carney's stance at the negotiating table, the difference with Washington couldn't be more pronounced. Trump continues to toss out tariff figures ranging anywhere from 15% to 50%, depending on which nation he considers cooperative or not at any given moment.
Canada is in a position where it can afford to be patient. The most important thing that we can remember that is true about Canada that is not necessarily true for other countries is no deal is better than a bad deal.
In recent days, Japan and the UK have each settled on 15% tariff agreements. But Canada, the United States' largest individual buyer of goods, is standing firm. Why? Because every Canadian premier across the political spectrum now agrees, no agreement is better than a harmful one. And a bad agreement would entrench tariffs that could burden industries for generations. At the same time, the lack of clarity in U.S. trade signals is sowing uncertainty for American enterprises. No one is sure what policies will be in effect next quarter, or even next week. Trump's tariffs were presented as a bargaining chip to extract better deals overseas, but the blowback is being felt domestically. In Canada, they've triggered a nationwide industrial resurgence. In the U.S., they're squeezing car makers, destabilizing logistics networks, and driving up costs for buyers. This isn't just an unintended consequence, it's a cautionary tale. That erratic trade policy doesn't only estrange partners. It acts as a self-imposed tax on the domestic economy. And this time, Canada isn't waiting around. It's forging a stronger foundation without needing approval. Trump's tariffs were meant to reinforce America's strength. Instead, they've revealed just how much influence the country has already ceded, not only in international commerce but in global leadership. President Donald Trump came back into office vowing to complete his earlier agenda: break foreign trade dependencies, restore U.S. manufacturing, and pressure allies into balanced trade terms. His preferred tool: tariffs. On April 2nd, dubbed Liberation Day by the administration, the White House announced widespread duties ranging from 10% to 50% on over 100 nations. Canada was hit with 35%. The European Union, 30%. China, 50%. Yet rather than causing trade partners to give in, the strategy is falling short. According to Morgan Stanley Investment Management, American firms in Q2 2025 posted better than projected earnings. But not because the tariffs helped. Rather because earlier forecasts had been overly pessimistic. Corporations had pulled back their projections in anticipation of significant tariff damage. But the worst didn't entirely unfold. So what happened? Supply routes adjusted. Expenses migrated. And a cloud of uncertainty left investors wary. The tariffs didn't collapse the markets, but they didn't revive domestic output either. Industrial expansion remains slow. Input costs have ticked up. The underlying rationale for Trump's trade approach is now facing serious doubts. I think that's accurate, ally. Absolutely. If you look back at public sentiment data from Trump's first term, you'd also see the narrowing gap between the US and China in global influence. While the economic impact remains uneven, the geopolitical price is becoming unmistakable. Longtime partners aren't storming off, they're quietly stepping back. European diplomats now call the US an unpredictable ally. Trade negotiations with the EU are at a standstill. Japan and South Korea are sealing independent energy agreements with Canada, bypassing Washington entirely. Meanwhile, Trump's foreign policy decisions, cutting U.S. foreign aid, downsizing international academic exchanges, and rolling back diversity efforts on college campuses, have chipped away at America's global appeal. According to Freedom House, the number of democracies worldwide has declined for 19 consecutive years. Trump didn't initiate that trend, but experts say he's speeding it up. U.S. influence once stemmed not only from its economy or military, but from credibility. That trust is fading and nothing is stepping in to replace it. As Washington throws up barriers, others are building alliances. China, once tentative, is now responding assertively. In April, Beijing hit back with counter-tariffs as high as 84% on U.S. imports. It also restricted rare earth exports, tightened licensing rules, and expanded Belt and Road investments. Over $1 trillion has been pledged across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, with little U.S. competition. Canada's reaction has been even more pointed. After facing 35% tariffs, Ottawa didn't just hit back with 25% duties, it went further. Prime Minister Mark Carney introduced a national economic pivot, expanding trade with Mexico and the EU, cutting dependence on American supply chains, and supporting regional trade alternatives. In June, Canadian tourism to the U.S. dropped over 40%, according to global travel sites. Several provinces banned U.S. liquor from public festivals, while Canadian shoppers quietly changed their habits. Trump's tariff-driven playbook was meant to assert dominance. In reality, it's exposed an uncomfortable fact. Influence isn't about volume, it's about necessity. And in 2025, more countries are showing they can walk away. China is no longer waiting for American approval. Canada is no longer asking for special treatment. Allies are turning elsewhere, and they're finding viable alternatives. What Trump promoted as national strength is beginning to resemble self-isolation. And the rest of the world is moving on, with or without the United States. U.S. President Donald Trump is showing no indication of backing away from his trade agenda, as new criticisms of Canada resurface, further straining bilateral ties. Still, the administration claims free trade with its neighbors isn't off the table. When U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick remarked that free trade with Canada remains possible, the statement surprised many. After months of threats, including tariffs up to 35%, the language suddenly felt less final. But the real question isn't whether Trump had a change of heart, it's what happened behind the scenes. Because while Trump keeps up the pressure, Ottawa may be holding a bargaining chip Washington can't afford to lose: energy, specifically uranium. Canada's largest uranium reserves are mined in Saskatchewan, shipped to Ontario, and processed across the border in the U.S. Amazon, Google, Meta, and Microsoft are all betting on nuclear power to sustain their AI-driven data centers. From California to Virginia, tech giants are building massive server farms, all requiring vast amounts of electricity, constant, clean, and carbon-free. Nuclear energy, long overlooked, is back in focus. And uranium, the critical input, is in short supply. America has tried to revive domestic mining. In 2024, it produced just 676,939 pounds, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. That's under 1.5% of the 48 million pounds the U.S. consumes annually, and demand is rising fast. Trump's own directives call for 190 million pounds per year by 2050 as nuclear generation quadruples. But here's the issue. The U.S. imports over 95% of its uranium, and much of the processing infrastructure is still controlled by geopolitical competitors, Russia and China. That makes Canadian supply essential. Saskatchewan's Cigar Lake mine, run by Cameco, meets 11% of global uranium demand, with a substantial portion, undisclosed but critical, flowing directly into America's fuel cycle. If Canada uses that leverage at the negotiating table, it could shift the entire dynamic. And uranium is just the tip of the spear. Beyond nuclear fuel, Canada also supports the U.S. energy grid with oil, gas, and hydroelectric power, all difficult to replace. Canada isn't waiting for Trump's outreach. It's already redirecting exports. In July 2025, Canada shipped its first LNG cargo to South Korea from the massive LNG Canada terminal in British Columbia. More projects like Cedar LNG and Woodfibre LNG are underway, creating fresh routes to Asia. Meanwhile, uranium deliveries to the European Union are accelerating. France's EDF inked long-term agreements with Canadian suppliers to reduce reliance on Russian material. Ironically, Trump's tariff strategy has sped up Canada's diversification. By looking to Asia and Europe, Ottawa has lessened its exposure to U.S. markets and gained new leverage. Yes, the U.S. does have other sources. Australia, for instance, provides uranium to American utilities. But that partnership is also facing headwinds. Tensions over drug pricing and rare earth policies are spilling into broader trade disputes. Other former suppliers like Russia and Belarus are under sanctions or off-limits. What remains is a short list, and Canada is at the top not only for uranium but for critical materials like nickel, aluminum, auto parts, and crude oil. Ontario alone holds the world's most accessible deposits of high-purity nickel, essential for electric vehicles, defense systems, and advanced AI servers. The supply chains are so tightly woven that untangling them would be nearly impossible. Trump has declared his goal is a golden era for the U.S. economy. But that will require more energy, more minerals, more metals, more lumber, and more concrete, most of which Canada already supplies. Uranium and energy more broadly aren't just products Canada sells, they're bargaining power. And in a standoff marked by tariffs and tough talk, that might be Canada's ace in the hole. Which is why, despite the noise, a limited agreement before August 1st remains a real possibility. Canada may accept narrowly defined tariffs on automobiles or metals, but only if its core energy exports are shielded. Because ultimately, this dispute isn't just about commerce. It's a test of whether two deeply interconnected economies can find stability in a time of rising tensions.